Hello everyone, sorry a couple of seconds late, just finishing a couple of things we'll talk about in a minute. Good morning, evening, we've got a full suite today. We've got, where are we, Canada, Mexico, New Zealand, Australia, Bruce is in Missoula still, JD's moved down from freezing cold Boston down to slightly less cold New Jersey, Israel, UK, okay, there's a few of you there. Cool. Okay, so there's lots of you from all over. Welcome. It's the normal Thursday session. Obviously, this week, this is the highlight of the week. It's the big thing that everyone's been waiting for, apart from the little competition thing that's going on in the US at the moment. So, welcome. We are going to be editing Capture One for the next hour. So, as per normal, there's a couple of things that are going to be announced today, which is quite cool. So, number one, before we even get going into Capture One, version check. So if you are not using Capture One, by all means go and download the free trial. It works for 30 days, no problem, and you'll get the very latest version. If you are using Capture One, everything that we show you in today's session is going to be in the current latest public release, which is 13.1.3, also known as 20.1.3. And for those of you that have been on these sessions for a while, you know that that's just a marketing thing. It's exactly the same version. If you go to the About section in Capture One, you're going to see it says 13.1.3. That's the latest version. If you're on a previous version, you have the option of upgrading. If you're on a subscription plan, you should always really be at the latest version anyway, because that's where all the bug fixes lie. Okay, so before we get going into editing, we've got something cool today. So everyone's been a little bit frazzled by offers and all that sort of stuff, and what's the best deal to move up to version 21 of Capture One. Well, I've got an idea of the best deal, which is this one. We can give you a free version of Capture One, or the update more importantly. So as of right now, it should all be live online. There is a competition running, and the competition is basically show us your best edit. Very, very simple. We are going to give away, that's me and Capture One, the update to version 21 at the point that it's released to one winner. There'll be a runner-up as well, which will, and the details are on that page, but basically there's some style packs that we'll send out. But the winner of the best edit will get the free update to version 21, or if you're already subscribing, we're going to actually extend your subscription by an entire year. So not a bad price. We are not looking for the best photograph, and that's the really important bit. We're looking for the best edit. So David Grover and I are going to go through these together. We're going to have a look at all the stuff that you guys send in. Hopefully there's some great stuff in there. And the person that produces the best edit, whether that's a natural edit or using a really cool feature that we hadn't thought of being used in that way, or just actually the best way of getting the best out of that camera. It could be a recovery. It could be lots of different things. But the one that we view as the best use of Capture One in its current version, we'll give away a free version for the next release. There we go. Really cool. So, not mandatory. It's not homework. You don't have to enter. You don't have to do it. But if you do want to, and for those people that are worrying about whether or not to go for Capture One 21 or whether to take advantage of an offer, well, here's an option that you have. You can go onto that page now, learn how to enter, and get going. Cool. That finishes on the 22nd of November, so just over 2 weeks. That's enough time, hopefully, for you guys to work out your best edit, and then send it on in. You cannot submit something that I've edited for you, just to cover that. I don't think that's in the rules specifically, but obviously you have to have edited it. And there we go. So good luck. Hope to see some really, really cool stuff. And in the meantime, let's get into our normal Capture One. So here is a shot that Sean sent in. We've got our grid enabled up here, which is why you've got those lines along there. I'm also going to show you, before we even get started, how to submit your image, because in that web page, or on that web page, you're going to see a little link that's, well, a little preview, a screenshot that tells you exactly how to send an EIP file. But for those of you that are a bit confused, so I'm just going to get rid of our viewer a second. So this is my browser. So the browser normally sits up here or on the bottom, depending on what I choose in my view menu. So I can do here, and I can choose place below, which means obviously goes down the bottom, or I can choose place to the right, which is my default setting for these sessions. So in your browser, which is the little version of your image, let me just hide the viewer there, I can right click and go to export original. So when you've done your edit, and this applies for if you want to send a version to someone or send an edit to someone to print or whatever, or someone to have a compare, or even to me to have a look at what you've edited, this is the same method. So export originals, not variants. The variant exports the thing flat, and we don't want to see the flat image, we want to see the edits you've made, and this brings across all the layers. So export originals. You choose where it's going to be sent in destination. You choose the file name, so typically that's the image name, but you can always add on to it as well. And this is the most important bit, pack as EIP. So if you pack it as an EIP, you'll see this little gray area becomes fixed, include adjustments. The EIP, and we talked about this last week, is the combined raw and adjustments file. So it's a lot smaller than a TIFF at 16-bit for sure. And it's basically one file. It's kind of like a little package. And in that file is the raw file with all the adjustments you've made in Capture One. You send that in to us, and David and I will have a look at them. And whoever has done the best job at editing gets their upgrade to 21 for free at such point that it's released. And that's all we're going to say about that. So there we go. So that's how to do it. The instructions are also on the webpage. So you just go to paulreefer.com/future-of-editing. And you'll get all the instructions, all the rules, and how to actually upload it, and the link to the upload site. So let's have a look at this picture. So this one is from Sean. Again, first things first, with all stuff in Capture One, we make sure that our lens corrections are loaded in first to the best they can be. In this case, it's loaded in the right lens, the lens that was actually used to shoot. Great. It's loaded in chromatic aberration. We can go to Analyze if we want, and that will then force Capture One to actually look at this image. So not just the chromatic aberration for the standard lens that the Capture One have tested in the lab in Denmark, but actually this image's aberrations. And it analyzes that lens on that sensor and what's come out, and it will fix them specifically to this setup. Now at f11 we might have a bit of diffraction in there. I'm not sure, having looked in there, it's that bad. Let's just go out to the edges a little bit, and let's just turn that tick on. Yeah, it sharpens it up a little bit. There's always another test that you can do. So zoom right in before you do diffraction correction. Don't just automatically put that tick in. Standard thing that we always talk about in these sessions is please use the lowest number of tools that you need to get the result you want. So if you're shooting at a wide aperture, 5.6 f4, something like that, you typically don't need diffraction correction, so don't enable it, because you don't know what other side effects it could be introducing. But in this case, if I turn this off, we see it's got a little blurry, a little softer out here on the lens. So if we turn it back on again, yeah, it sharpened it up a bit, so we may as well leave that in place. Now at 55mm there's not going to be much distortion, and we know that because Capture One has already said for this image on this lens we don't need to roll in any distortion correction. If we wanted to, we could. It punches it a little bit, but it's not going to improve the image, so why touch it? And then purple defringing, well, if you've got any really, really high contrast lines, you might see some purple lines. In this particular case, there isn't any, or there aren't any, so there's no point, again, in touching those buttons if you don't need to. So with that done, we know that we've got our lens profile loaded in correctly, so this is the best version of a base image we can start with. Now we're going to go into our film curves. So we sort of go in and out of these things, and we talk about them every now and then. So let's have a look at what the film curves will do. So where this was shot on a Fuji camera, we talk about it quite a lot. Fuji, and now starting Nikon, will send across the film curves and the film profiles and simulations into Capture One. So it opens up all of these extra simulations. Oh, that one's not bad actually. But it opens up all these extra simulations that you could have applied in the camera. And if you haven't applied them in the camera, you can also apply them in Capture One. But in this case, actually the auto curve, so Capture One's standard, or the default that's loaded in from the camera in this case, is actually pretty good. It's probably one of the better options that we've got out of that list. So I'm going to leave it on that, but we'll come back to that later on, and you'll see the difference and why we might want to change that on another image. So onto our main tab in Capture One, and that's this one. I'm just going to make this a bit smaller so the picture's a bit bigger for you. So in this case, it's our exposure tab, the histogram, that we use the most, and you'll see that's the one that we're in most of the time. One question's just come up saying from Andreas, I have a Leica Q2, what lens correction should I use? I'm not sure, is the Q2, does that have interchangeable? Basically, whatever Capture One has recommended. So the argument is on all of these ones, there's an order. So if Capture One has loaded in the profile for your lens and it's recognized the lens that you were using, then wonderful, use that one. If not, hopefully you get access to this one, manufacturer profile. That's like the second best. If not, then go to generic. General rule. So the correct lens, if Capture One has recognized it, or if you are sure it's the right lens, but Capture One for whatever reason hasn't picked it up in the EXIF data. If you haven't got that exact lens that you're using, look out for manufacturer profile, load that one in. And if it hasn't got that one, it just won't appear if it hasn't loaded in a manufacturer profile into the raw, then go to generic. So those are the three. So specific lens, manufacturer profile, followed by generic in that order. Okay, so JD's saying when version 21 comes out, will you have an immediate session of demo, or will you defer to David Grove and Capture One? No, we'll be doing it live. The second Capture One is publicly available, version 21. We'll do the next live session. We'll do that, and we'll probably have some stuff that goes out about the differences and so on pretty quick from that point. So yeah, it's not they're not exclusive. JD will do them both together. Okay, and Guillaume, release date for Capture 21, please. Sometime between now and forever. I can guarantee that. Okay, so in our histogram, this is where most of our adjustments are made. And it's because actually most of the tools are loaded in here by default. Remember with Capture One, you can always add tools into any of these tabs as well. So I can add in extra tools into my color tab or whatever. These are the default workspaces that we're using. So the default workspaces will lend itself to having you in the exposure tab most often. But if you're finding there's tools that you want to skip by and you never use one or whatever, you can always right click and you can remove some of the tools and add your own in and create your own workspace. That's the important part with this. Build it around you. So on this one, let's just think about what we want to have a look on the image. So I'd like this forest stuff to be a bit richer, just to bring out those autumn colors really well. I'd like the mountain to start to come a bit more into the foreground, a little, not the foreground, but a little bit more as the subject. So in those terms, we've got almost a set of recipes that we want to touch. And the recipe is going to be, let's deepen and enrichen the foreground, the forest. Let's bring out the texture and the details in the mountains, and let's see what we can pull back in this sky. Because actually, if I go on here to my exposure warning, there's nothing that's actually clipped. The sky's got a huge amount of detail in it. If I pull down this highlight and that white area, and let's even pull down the exposure, we can see all this stuff within the sky here. It's just the default, as it was shot, is a little bit over. So we can probably try and bring that down as well. So first thing, let's try and enrichen the forest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new layer. And I'm going to call this one forest. And we're going to do a gradient mask. So you've got two gradient options in Capture One. This one here is the round gradient, so radial, which effectively allows us to do a vignetted mask in any location of any shape of circle or oval that you want. And then we've got the traditional linear gradient, just like a gradient or grad filter on your camera. So I'm going to press M for mask. So you've also got the options down here. M turns on the always display mask, but it also turns off the mask. So you use M to turn it on and M to turn it off. It can get confusing if you've got the mask turned off and you don't know, because for instance, if I'm drawing this like that, it's only when I start drawing the mask that I realize, oh, I don't have my mask on. So press M on the keyboard and you'll see the red appear. So as always, the mask, the red area is the area that's going to be most affected. So 100% anywhere south of this line, 50% here and 0% here. So anything above this line has no effect on what I'm doing. And this is our fall off. The softer, so in other words, the bigger I make that fall off, the more subtle the difference between the areas of the image that are having 100% of the effect applied and the areas that are having 0% of the effect applied. Okay, so with this one down here, what we can do actually is we can use our little saturation boost. So saturation, be really careful with. If you do it too much, it looks horrible. If we pull it down to sort of somewhere less than 15, you're probably in a safe zone. But even there, I'm seeing these trees might be a little bit over the top. So I'm just going to pull it down, probably down to about 10 or 11, something about there. Yeah. So again, saturation slider, a little bit like the contrast one, which I I think people now think I hate the contrast slider. I don't. It's just the case of it's a very blunt tool. Same with saturation. So if you really want to get into individual colors, use the color editor. So go to the color tab. Down here, you've got the basic color editor, which you can lay out here, or we've got advanced, and I could choose a color in this area here and say, well, actually anywhere in this arc, we're going to change the hue, the saturation, the lightness. That's going to give you a more detailed effect, a more specific change. But if it's overall, you want to just give it a little bit of a pump, then use saturation by all means, just don't overdo it. Now clarity is going to make everything just punch a little bit more. We're going to leave it as natural, because if I do it on something like punch, you're going to see again it's boosting saturation again. We've already done that with our saturation slider, so I'm going to leave the natural clarity on, and we're going to punch that maybe up to 20 on the scale. Same with clarity, a little bit goes a long way, so don't overdo it. But there we go. So Daniela's just asking, did you use an empty or filled layer? So I clicked on an empty layer. So this layer here started out with just a plus. So the default, if you just click on the plus sign here, it will always default to an empty adjustment layer. If you want it to be filled, so in other words, everything affected, so the whole screen goes red, then you need to hold down your mouse on the plus sign and click on this one that says new filled, or let go on new filled adjustment layer instead. Same with clone, same with heal, but they've got some automated features as well for the first one. So let's just have a look at our mountain now. So different piece. So let's just go onto a new layer again. I've created an empty layer, and we're going to call that mountain. And I have my mask showing, but there's no mask on it because it's an empty layer. So as I start to paint, we're going to see that start to appear. Good. So there's my 100% mask on my mountain. Now I want to be, sorry, just get rid of that question off the screen so you can see. And one other question's just come in. So where can we get other ICC profiles if the lens is not listed? From Capture One. So the answer is, and it's unfortunate, but this is the reality. The list of ICC profiles is controlled by the guys in Capture One. They will add a lens in based on a mix of, is it a massively popular lens, is it a high-end professional lens, is it a lens that a lot of people have asked for, is it a lens that should have always been in there that some people have put in a support request. If you don't see your lens listed, go to support.capture1.com, lodge it as a feature request so that they cover that lens. It's only when enough people start to ask for a slightly more obscure lens that Capture One may even know about it. So the default manufacturer ones, you know, the standards, the Nikons, the Canons, the Sonys, the Phase Ones, the whatever, they will typically always be supported. But if it's not, then go on to support.capture1.com, put the request in, and it's only when enough people do it, effectively, that it means that Denmark are actually going to go into a lab, get that actual lens. So that's what they have to do. They actually get the lens, sit in a dark room, and do all the profiling. And it's quite a detailed process. So they're never going to be able to cover every lens in the world. And if there's one that's missing that you think should be in there, the only way of letting them know is through that support site. Okay. So with our mountain painted, well, of course, it's a very rough painting. So for example, on here, if I were to turn that mask off, let's say I was going to do a massive clarity change. Well, it gets the mountain, great, but it's also clipping some of this stuff because my mask goes down over the forest. And likewise, if I were to pull down our exposure, well, it's also getting this stuff too. So we don't want that. We want to isolate the mountain. So let's see what we can do with the luma range. So there's my mask. And our luma range basically mimics our histogram. So we've got our histogram here, and this luma range is saying anything from 20 to 235 out of a scale of 0 to 255, including the mask. But it's also got these ramps, and it says anything 0 don't include, anything 255 don't include. But as you get nearer to 235, then slowly increase. So a bit like that border on the gradient. So effectively feather the mask. So what that means is I can have a really long feather. Well, that's quite handy, isn't it? Or I can have a really binary mask. So if I have a binary mask like this, you can see there's no give whatsoever in that mask. So it's either on or off. So at 190, for example, down here, in fact, let's just apply that and zoom in so you can see. So here's my mask here with a luma range, which is binary. There's no fall off at all. What that means is the changes that I make to this layer now will have a 100% effect on everywhere that's red, but 0 effect immediately on an area that's not red. Well, that's fine, but on a mountain, those areas aren't just binary. It's not sort of snow, mountain. There's snow, a little bit of snow, a little bit of snow, less low, and then the mountain. So it feathers naturally. So we need our luma range to mimic that as well. And you can see as I draw this ramp up, effectively, or the fall off as it's called, slowly, it actually starts to, it's still not affecting this area quite so much, but it's feathering it. Makes it more natural. That's the key thing. So we can also, in this, so where's our binary mask, we can add a radius. So a radius, think of this as like a blur. So the edge of that mask, well, now it's blurred. So there's a little bit of softness at the edge. And the sensitivity slider, I can go to be slightly sharper effectively, or slightly more blurry, depending on where this slider sits. It's defaulted at 50. This only comes alive when you have a radius set. So if I wanted, for example, to make sure that our mountain up here was really soft at its edges in my mask, well, what I could do is have a really soft fall off here. Let's go to there. And I can have a really wide radius and a really low sensitivity. And now we'll see that this is all really soft and it's a lovely fall off. Great. But on a mountain, that doesn't help me because I need to isolate the edges. I need to make sure that the mask is affecting the mountain and not the sky behind. In this case, it will start to lose some of the change in that mask from down the bottom here, where we're at 100% of that mask, and it will slowly lose that effect all the way up to about here. You can see there's still some pink left of the red up there. And that's because we've got this massive radius. So we really don't want that. We want to make sure that we've got a crisp mountain, but a soft fall off here. So let's go to our luma range and say, okay, we'll have maybe a tiny bit of radius on there, but the fall off is more important. I don't want to include these clouds up here. So we need to be very careful to pull it down to about there. That works. Add a bit of fall off in. So we've got a soft fall off around here. And then the dark areas down here, which effectively is this foresty area, we can pull this up until we're not affecting quite so much of the forest. There's always going to be a bit that's included because you've got similar shades. But then again, I can do a fall off here. And now I've got a mountain range separated. I didn't have to draw around the mountain range. You can do that with auto masking. So on YouTube, you'll find the pro tip stuff. You're going to have, there's about a 20-minute video that we did about the way the auto masking works and how you can refine the edges of the mask. That's another way of doing this. But we don't actually need to on here. We can use this really quick way using the luma range to say, I only want this section of the histogram to be included in this change. So let's apply that. Now, with that area, I'm going to turn my mask off so I can see what I'm doing. And then we can increase our clarity by quite a way. We can really push this in the mountain, but we can also pull down our exposure. And look at what's happening now. We're getting an effect here on the trees that I really don't want, but we can erase that in a second. But as I pull down the exposure, we get a bit more detail, a bit of structure put in around all the edges. So in all these textured areas down here, being unfair, we're at 340 odd %, but without and with, or if I do a before and after view. So that's with our change, that's without our change. There's a bit of noise creeping in here, so we're going to just back away some of this structure and some of the clarity. That's fine. And we're going to back up to there. Good. So now we've got a lot more detail in the mountains coming back without affecting any of this stuff down here. If we had affected it, if I right click on this mask and say rasterize the mask, we want to, actually that should do us. Didn't need to rasterize because I painted it in the first place. That was me being silly. So my luma range obviously applies to the mask that I've painted. If I want to get rid of these trees, well, I can just erase them manually down here. And if I wanted them to have a nice little fall off on the edges, well, I make sure I'm using a soft brush, so 0% hardness. And also we could pull down our opacity or our flow if we wanted to do it in sort of layers just to pull it back. But in this case, I'm kind of happy with that change there. That's fine. And remember, we're not doing anything major with the tree area. We're not increasing its saturation or anything like that. So if we have gone over the trees a little bit, it's not the end of the world. We're not losing anything. but now we've got that mountain really coming up into view. Okay, where are we? There's a couple of questions. June, dear Capture One, I need to speak to someone at Capture One in the recent order. June, you need to go to support.capture1.com, which isn't me, unfortunately. So support.capture1.com is where everything, technical everything that you need, because that gets you directly through to Capture One rather than me. I use Capture One, but I do not work for them, unfortunately. So that's the best way. And then Dan's just asking, you use fill mask to include the snow or the snow patches within the mountain range. You could, but remember they were actually already included, Dan. It's just the luma range that's excluding them. So of course I've rasterized now, but effectively imagine, so that mask I painted, so it was included, but it's the luma range that's taking those snow bits out. So if I right click on the mask and say fill mask, the mask is already filled. It's the luma range that's taking it out, so it's not going to actually cover the snow. We'd have to either rasterize it and then fill it in manually, like I just did with the eraser, or you'd have to somehow find a way of including it in the luma range itself. Okay, and then finally, sky. Let's call this one sky. Fine. I don't have to be too careful with this one, because if I draw a nice little gradient down here, I don't mind if I include the mountain in this. Why? Because I'm going to be pulling down highlights and maybe whites more than highlights, which the mountain generally doesn't sit inside. We could pull up a touch of saturation if we wanted to, okay. But now what I've got is actually a slight blue tint to some of this stuff. So what we're going to do is just click on this mountain and we're going to say, well, let's warm that up a little bit. And definitely down in the forest, let's warm that up a little bit. There we go. And that's probably where I'd leave it. So in this case, we go from, where are we? Here. It's a really nice shot. It's a natural looking shot. All we've done here is just enrich. Let me just turn off our, I was on the gradient tool so you can see those lines. All we've done is do the three things actually that I said, but we've enriched the forest. We've pulled back some of the detail in the sky, but not too much. And we've just made that mountain stand out a little bit more. That's it. It doesn't need much more than that. If we really wanted to make sure that we're covering the whole breadth of the range of print, then we'd pull our levels down a little bit from the top and up from the bottom. So we're effectively stretching that histogram. We're taking it from whatever was 241 is now 255, and whatever was 7 is now 0. So the darks get darker and the lights get lighter. That maybe gives it a bit of a boost when it's printed, but again, there's nothing that wrong with this shot to start with. It's just a really nice autumn scene. So there we go. Okay, let's go on to Francois' shot. I was going to cover keystoning with this, but it doesn't actually need a keystone. It's just a rotation by the look of it. So first off, again, lens correction. So in this case, it's picked up. Let's just go into our EXIF data. So it's a Nikon 2470 2.8E EDVR. Let's go into our Nikon section, and we probably don't have, is it not that one? Nikon 2470 2.8E EDVR. I think it's that one. Which is a little bit weird because I don't think an extender is used on this one. And it just hasn't picked it up. So, as we were talking about just now, if you can see your exact lens, which I think is that one, yep, then we can load in the profile. Fine. That was kind of handy. So we're going to do that analyze on chromatic aberration. At f8, there's probably not much diffraction. If I want to have a look in here and see what that does it sharpen things up? No, not really. So I'm going to leave it off. But what we have got here is a bit of a lean. We're certainly leaning to the right a little bit. Just some other questions. Where are we? So can you use a brush, this is from Daniela, or some of the sort to erase parts of the mask instead of the luma range? Yes, you can. You just go to that. So if I hadn't done the luma range, I wouldn't have needed to rasterize it. So if I go to the rasterize mask, I can then effectively fix that luma range where it was, and I can start to erase and add in into the mask manually if I want to. That's fine. And then Claudia's just said, with the current dynamic range of cameras, especially mine, why do we even need actual graduated NDs? Simply because, unfortunately, the difference between highlights and darks is still well above 15 stops in a lot of cases. So I've been in places where at sunrise or even in cities, if you imagine a city skyline at sunset, your sky and your sunlight can easily be way out of that range of 15 stops into towards the shadows and the deep darks within the city and the silhouette effectively. So it depends what you're shooting. You can get you can get pretty close, certainly with things like frame averaging with phase ones or the dual exposure plus function that we use now. That extends the dynamic range to just about enough to be able to deal without a graduated filter. But every now and then I've still got a GND on the front of the camera just to balance out that scene. So it's just about I can't remember what the number was. There's a number about how many stops of dynamic range your eyes have, and cameras are still nowhere near. They'll get there maybe, but right now no. Okay, so we could keystone it, but I think this one can easily be done with just a simple rotate. So instead of trying to drag 4 different lines around and try and get it level, we can do it this one. So that's a rotate. All I've done is drawn along what should be the horizon. There's another check that we can do to make sure that we've done it correctly. So if I go to view guides, this gives me a horizontal and a vertical guide, and I can use the boats just to check. And what you've got to be careful of with boats is their masts aren't always completely straight depending on what the boat is doing. So we can also use these buildings, and all I'm doing is just looking at the vertical lines and making sure things like the reflection line up. So this mast may not be completely straight, but what I'm looking at is, does the top of the mast here and its reflection here match, which it does. Same here, that's not too far out. This one's a little bit out, so it's getting a little bit out, but it's by a fraction of a degree. I wouldn't even try to fix that. But most importantly, we have a level horizon, which is what we're looking for. So I'm going to turn my guides off, so view guides. Right, now my gut feel is there's an awful lot of extra detail in the sky up here. There's actually some pink up in the sky. But this down here isn't adding much into the scene. So my first thought is, why don't we give it a bit of a crop and into 1:2. So let's just give that a try. I've got a debate in my head just looking at this shot as to whether I want this mast on the right hand side, and I don't think I do. Same logic that I've talked about it before with you guys. So especially when you print, when you get to the edge of a frame, you don't want a new distraction or a new artifact or effect creeping into the frame. It just feels uncomfortable. As humans, we kind of want things to complete. We want things to finish and be satisfied when we get to the edge of something. And if we start something like this edge of this mast, I kind of need to see the rest of it to be comfortable. So let's just have a little play. If I remove this out of the crop, and what I'm doing, so again, on that same basis, you see these lines here that lead up to a mast. Well, that's going to give the impression that I'm missing something. So I'm going to come here to this tree. So you can see there, the tree sort of drops down. We're happy with that. That's the end of a tree. And that means that I could shift up to here a little bit. Don't worry about if it's on the middle or the 1/3 line. It's up to you. In terms of composition, I'm going to probably move it to about there, because I want to include some of this sky up above. And that sort of does us there. Now, I'm still in that place where this boat, okay, I wonder if we want to go even more brutal. Oops, sorry, just hit the wrong one there. So what would happen if I came in right into there? And although this feels pretty severe as a crop, I'm just going to switch our ratio as well back up to 2:3. So when you're cropping, hold down the mouse over here. You're going to get your different options of ratio, and the 2:1 sort of worked as it was a long piece, but I'm kind of in a place where if I can lose this bright white box here and maybe move as much as I can up here, I just think that's a much more complete photo, a finished photo. I don't have all this stuff over here on the right that's sort of starting a whole new story that sort of doesn't finish. This feels like it's complete. So that's what I'm going to go for in this case. But if you don't like it, obviously you could undo that, and you could include more onto the right. Okay, so with this shot, there's not actually that much to do with it. It's a really well exposed shot. If I go to our exposure tab, we can see we've got a little bit of room up here in the highlights, but using these things at the top, these little numbers, we're just going to move our mouse around and have a look. So In the whites, we're at 214, 215 on red, so we're not quite at 255. We've got a bit of room. We could punch some of the histogram up a little bit. We do that with levels. So if I know that my brightest areas here are around 215, I know that I can safely probably pull this down to about 220, something like that. And then equally in the shadows, we could pull this down a little bit more just to get a bit more contrast. Now, we've then got a decision to make as to whether we prefer it more pastel and more muted, or whether we prefer it more vivid, effectively. And I'm sort of in a place where halfway is not a bad place to be. So I think that gives us a bit more of a stretch in the histogram, a bit more in terms of highlights, a bit more in terms of shadow, in terms of depth of shadows, but we haven't pushed it so far that it's become too contrasty. And going back to the point earlier about contrast, absolutely, so wrong one. We can use the contrast one, but again, remember what the contrast tool is doing. It's drawing a line down the middle and it's making everything brighter than 128 effectively bright, everything darker than 128 dark, and you just get this separation in the histogram. It's nowhere near as subtle as a pull in levels or even better in curves. Right, so in here with the overall picture, well, we can pull up a few of the shadows. Not too much. If we do that, it starts to look cartoony. Don't do that, really bad. So we pull up enough shadows so that we can see the details that might have been lost, but I want to keep contrast. So there's no point in trying to add a load of contrast in if we're then going to try and flatten it out with all the HDR tools. The HDR tools reduce contrast. That's the key thing with what they do. Okay, so with this one here, we could pull down our highlights a little bit, but then we've just raised them up using levels. So I think a couple times ago, we did like a fire blanket so you can protect your highlights, and then that allows you to bring the levels of the whole image up. That was a couple sessions ago. In this case, there's no point. I want to bring the highlights up, so recovering them is just going to darken them down again. No benefit to that. Instead, I'm going to create a new gradient mask. Now, I said about the masks, if I hold down the plus symbol, I've got the choice of an empty layer, a filled layer, a clone layer, or a heal layer. With any of the mask tools, like a gradient filter or any of the heal tools, the first time you start drawing a layer, it's going to automatically create the right type of layer for you, but only on the first time. So the first time I create a heal layer, it's going to add a healing layer for me. I don't have to create the layer first. From then on, if I wanted another heal layer, there's a few different reasons, if I wanted another heal layer, I have to create a new heal layer first, otherwise it will default back to the first one it created. Right, so we've got our mask. I'll turn the N button on to see that mask, and with this one I'm going to pull down the exposure, but I'm also going to pull up our saturation. The reason being, as I pull down exposure, I lose a bit of luminosity in the, well, not luminosity, but I lose a bit of saturation in the color. So as I pull that down, I try and factor in a bit of a change with a bit of exposure. And that also brings out this nice little subtle pink up here. So we'll call this one Sky. And with our bottom, I'm going to pull up a new layer. So this one, I have to create the layer, adjustment layer 1. We'll call this one Water. And with this one, we're also going to pull down exposure just a bit. And all it's doing is it's pulling the focus into that center. And then with our center, actually what we could do is just be really lazy. I'm going to create a new empty layer. I'm going to call this one Boats. And with my radial mask, so a circular or a oval graduated filter, I'm going to have a really soft fall off. So it works in exactly the same way as linear one. The further apart these lines, the softer the fall off. But I don't want to affect out here. What I want to do is affect in here. So I'm going to right click on the layer and say invert. And then you can see the effect it's having. So over here. And with this layer, just press the M key to make the mask go away. With this layer, we're going to increase our clarity a touch like that. And I'm just going to bring a little bit of white back just to get some detail. And that's it. Now, those are all, and you've seen, those are all really small changes. They're really tiny differences that we've made in each of the tools. Hardly anything in them. But if I do our before and after, you'll see we go from there. Lovely picture. But let me just get rid of our mask, our radial thing that's distracting. So we go from there to here. So again, really subtle change, but it's just boosted that picture a little bit more. We've just got a bit more vibrancy about it. We go from here up to here. That's all we're doing. Now, if I went to our original and just compare the two, so here's our original here, here's our final one. I think that's a better crop. I think it's a better print. But up to you. So where are we? A couple of questions in there, or questions and statements, I guess. So I also said the same as thought on the crop. David said, I often use a letterbox crop, but almost always an unconstrained ratio. Yeah, we've sort of talked about this before. Typically, these ratios up here, in terms of the defaults, are easy printable ratios. So if I go to print a 2x3 shot, there's no issue. If I go to frame a 3x4 shot, it's a standard medium format aperture. Same with 2x1 for panoramic, same with 1x3. Of course, you can do whatever size crop you want. If you wanted to, and actually I think it was, who was it? Alan's just said the empty space at the left of the boats is distracting. So if you don't want that, then just change your crop tool here to unconstrained. Let's just get off of here, and I can pull this in to a completely arbitrary ratio that I've chosen. That's completely up to you. We don't have to stick to those specific ratios. However, it's easier printing and framing, and actually, if you want to sell print, it's generally easier with a ratio that people can understand very easily and they can measure very easily, rather than something a bit more random. But there is nothing in a rule book, and in fact, even if there was, I'd ignore it. There's no rule to say you have to stick with those ratios. It's just they're the ones that I guess we've just grown up with and we're used to. Now, out of a camera, obviously, a standard DSLR, a 35mm camera, will give you a 3:2 ratio. A medium format camera will give you a 4:3 ratio. But other than that, you can do whatever you like. Is there a way to emulate the dehaze option you can do in Lightroom? So there is. In fact, personally, I don't like the way that Lightroom does dehazing. We covered it last week. My concern with single button dehaze things is simply that haze is different. The haze from a street light is different to the haze of fog, which is different to the haze of pollution, which is different to the haze underwater, on mountains. It's all different. I think you're better off learning how the tools that you've got in terms of curves and clarity and so on can fix the haze that you're seeing in your particular picture, rather than just clicking on a button and hoping that the software gets it. Because quite often the artifacts that the software then adds in, things like rainbow colors and stuff like that in gray areas, is really distracting, and it's wrong. So if you go on to, again, it's all on YouTube, there's a pro tips called Dehaze tool in Capture One that will cover a lot of that. So have a look at that. Where were we? Francois, was my edit overdone for the colors? Was my export, want to see my edit? I'm not sure what you mean, Francois. I know you sent a DNG, so I don't know whether this was already the edited version. But yeah, so Francois, I used the contrast slider again, you didn't. So again, I just covered, I think, the reason why. And it's simply down to how you're expanding that histogram. And the problem, here's the perfect example, actually. If we look at our histogram here, so for the contrast slider to work perfectly, I kind of need a histogram that's almost a perfect pyramid, because effectively it's taking that middle point, it's pushing this stuff brighter, pushing this stuff darker. It's not in this case. It's not quite there. And we can see in this histogram down here, I'm having to pull down the highlights more than I am the shadows. So the contrast slider is just a very blunt instrument that's going to go 50% to the right, 50% to the left. Most pictures don't sit with all their data right in the middle. Most of the images that we deal with, the histogram data sits somewhere around to the right and to the left, which means the contrast tool will end up effectively making your image look either too dark, like that in the shadows, or too bright in the highlights. You're a bit better off doing it a little bit more manually. It takes a bit longer, but the tools can give you a better result. Okay, so moving on, we've got Willem's shot, and this one's actually probably quite a quick one just to cover off. So effectively, this one, I had a look at it. It's loaded in the lens profile, no problem. Don't have to worry about diffraction f4, I hope, with this. And we are looking at an image which has got quite a lot of highly saturated color. Now, if I compare to the previous shot of Francois, now this was very still water for a start, but over 13 seconds, yeah. So the stiller the water, ironically, the less of a long exposure you need. If the water is pretty choppy, like it was here, a longer exposure would have actually given us a lot more of a smooth effect. We would have got that milky water effect with these lines coming down. So my temptation on this would have been, rather than an 1/18 of a second, maybe not use quite such a high ISO. So that ISO at 3200, that's a pretty high ISO. And I think you might have got a slightly better result had you used a lower ISO, but for a longer shutter speed. So, maybe a 2 or 3 second long shot at a much lower ISO, and you would have got that lovely sort of trail of milky reflection in the water instead. However, this is what we have, and it's loaded in the Fujifilm profile, this vivid Velvia profile. Now the problem with it is, I've just looked at auto. You see what it's done to the colors. Now I'm not sure what profile was loaded in to make the auto do that, but if I go to linear response, look at these two in terms of that color saturation. It's just made everything really, really pop, and that can be good, but I'm just worried that it's popping a little bit too much yellow. The whole scene has got this sort of greeny yellow tint to it. So I'm going to leave that profile in place. We're going to leave the curve in place as a film simulation, but we're going to use our color editor to just back off some of this stuff. Now I want to check one other thing as well. And again, it all comes down to perception in some cases. But with my guides, let me just have a look at, are we level? So this is level here. This is slightly leaning in, that one's level there. It just feels like it's not quite. It feels like it's leaning a bit down to the right, and I'm not sure why. I just want to try a little change. It's a tiny little change, but sometimes they are with rotation. You see that change there? It's a tiny little change, but I think that just feels a bit better. It just feels more level to me along this line here. Okay, right, now I've pulled up the, sorry, who was it? It was Willems. Sorry. So Willems already pulled up the black slider, which has got a lot more detail in here. If I go before and after, this was the original shot here. This is the edit. And I don't have a problem with any of the HDR stuff that's been done. So to pull up all this detail in the blacks is a good move. I'd maybe back it down a little bit. But what I would do is pull down my whites a lot more, down the highlights a lot more. So I get all this detail back in these windows from where they were. So if I look into here, and we go before and after, we can actually see what's going on inside the building with this recovery done. So I'm going to leave that in place so we've got more detail in there. But what we've also got on there is this strange level adjustment, which I'm just going to show you what that's done. So there's before, there's after. So normally with levels, we're doing it to make things more vibrant. In this case, what Willem's done is he's pulled, and there's a reason for doing this, but effectively we've crushed the histogram. We've made it less vibrant by using the top sliders instead of the bottom ones. So I'm just going to back that off a little bit, not completely, but I'm just going to back it off a little bit just to get a bit more of that vibrance back into this. But what I'm then going to do is go to my color editor, and I'm going to go to my basic color editor, because that's all it needs. I can click on this bit here, which is going to tell me it's in the yellows, and pull down our saturation and pull down the lightness. And I'm also going to click into here, which is probably in the green area, yeah, and pull down again that saturation and down the lightness a little bit. It just feels a little less vivid, over vivid, let's call it that. In my head, it just needs a little bit of a back off just to make it feel a bit better. And then one final thing we're going to do is just add an extra little layer along here, so a gradient layer up to here, because again, the same principle as I was talking about before with the boats. I want the image to fall off as I get nearer to the edge. I want to end the story effectively. So I'm going to pull down saturation as well, and down our exposure, and I'm actually going to alter this to be a slightly harder fall off down towards the bottom here. And that just finishes off the shot. So rather than getting lighter as we get nearer to us, effectively we're moving into the image, and we don't lose any detail in there either at the same time. Now on these side bits here, we've got a little bit of room with our crop, so I'm going to go to original as our crop, and I'm just going to pull that in there and pull that in there, because again, I don't want these things starting at the edge of the frame. I'm just going to shift it up a little bit because again, we don't need all of this down here. And to me, that's just, again, they're minor tweaks compared to Willem's original edit. And when we go from there to here, I see what you were trying to do. I get the HDR effect, and I get that you want to pull up all these shadows here. I just wonder whether we could back some of them away just a bit, just to keep a bit more contrast. Yeah, and actually, that's a fair point. Actually, Pablo's just said less clarity and structure in the water. It's a fair point, actually. So yeah, let's just do one final little extra layer. And on this one, I'm going to add an on the top gradient to about there. So in this case, I just want all of the water. And remember, clarity, we can increase clarity, but we can also decrease it, so we can make it smoother. And the same with structure. So with that layer here, well, we've actually smoothed out that water a little bit. It's not the same as if we'd done a long exposure. But yes, Pablo, so your question, yeah, negative ones, absolutely. So we can reduce the amount of distraction we've got in the water, but we are relatively limited based on what was originally shot. Okay, where were we? A couple other questions. Where were we? In Photoshop, I take a unconstrained image and put them on a conventionally sized canvas. Yeah, so you can in terms of the mat, so you can make the borders work in a standard size for sure. But you know, that's just down to how you want to print things, David. What's the ratio for 2 1/4 by 3 1/4 format in the well, you can literally just put that in. So if you want to create your own crop, you can go into here and you can say add an aspect ratio, and I can type in 2.25 for 2 1/4 by 3.25 by 3 1/4. We'll call it, where are we? RB67. Okay. And then as I select that crop, which will now be down here in my custom crops, I can then do that. And I've now got that ratio. So you can always add your own ratios in here by literally just putting in those numbers in the lat box. So hopefully that answers that one. Okay, a couple of other extra ones. We'll come back to them. I just want to touch on Roland's shot. So Roland asked the question, how do I separate the bird from the background? First off, again, load in your lens profile. Probably not worried about diffraction in this shot. Capture One has already decided there's some distortion. You can see it there. So back up to the 100 mark. It's corrected the distortion in this lens, Sony FE. So our curve here is what's doing this. So the auto curve is making that bird and these highlights really, really, really bright. I'm just going to change the curve to say linear response and look at the difference. So I could do this by going into my histogram and I could pull down the highlights, I could pull down the white areas and get all that stuff back. But I don't even need to do that. If I stop Capture One from going a bit over the top with this curve, so the auto curve will always try and make things quite vivid and punchy, and just switch it to linear response, I get a much more similar to the raw piece of content than what I do with the auto curve loaded in. So with that curve loaded in, now we can tweak. So we've got all of this detail back here in terms of all of this stuff. If I go to before and after, look how much we're getting back, which is great. But we want to make sure that these guys are the star of the show. So a couple of things then. Number one, let's think about the crop. We want to keep the nest for sure, but is this stuff up here adding anything? I'm not so sure. So maybe I want to just pull down into there, or even we could even go into there, but I want less distraction, not more. So let's go there. And in fact, we're even going to go further than that. We're going to go into there, I think. Okay, so now it feels that we're closer into what's going on. Now, what we can also do is use our very handy little radial gradient. So obviously, it's a form of vignetting, but the Vignette Tool in Capture One, so if you scroll down on the Exposure tab, you'll get to the Vignette Tool, and this basically, let me just turn this layer off. So the vignette literally goes into the corners and out at the middle. Great. But there is a problem with that, which is if your subject isn't smack bang in the middle of the lens or in the middle of the scene, then that's not going to help me, because it's going to darken areas here that I wanted to keep in the subject, and it's going to darken areas over here and lighten areas here that I don't want. So instead, we can use a radial gradient. And again, keep it soft, so that fall off needs to be really, really subtle, otherwise you're going to see a ring where it's been done. And with this, we can now pull down our exposure into this background. And if I don't like how much it's pulled down the exposure here, but I do like it here, well, I can right click on this and say rasterize. So in other words, stop behaving like a gradient, start behaving like a normal layer. And I can go to my eraser tool, so either here or press E on the keyboard for erase. Right click, and we're going to make it quite big, and I'm going to go to probably 25, something like that in opacity. And I can start erasing parts of what I've done just to bring back some of the brightness down here. So think of it like a selective vignette. So I've got my mask. If I turn this mask into grayscale so you can see, let's go to display grayscale mask, you can see I've got the area here that was now left alone, but also we can effectively pull this out here as separate information. So we can choose to erase these things separately from it being a gradient, but you can only do that once you rasterize the mask. So you need to right click on the mask. If you've done it through a linear gradient or a gradient that's a radial version, you need to rasterize it first before you can erase a part of the mask. But this allows me a huge amount more control. A couple of you have said, NST's just said, so how about a crop in portrait? Absolutely. So let's right click on here and go to clone variant. Now I can go back to my crop, and instead of that version, we can do this version. So we're going to get a bit limited in terms of what we can get to here. I just want to look at something. Is that a piece of trash that the birds have made? Yeah. So the birds have made their nest out of a piece of fabric or a piece of trash or whatever. Not sure how I feel about that. But yes, we can have a portrait version. Now what it's done is it's carried over that mask, because remember, when you draw the gradient mask or the radial gradient mask, even though we only drew it in this cropped version here, the mask carries on outside of the crop. So even though you can see there, so even though it's actually quite tight in this crop, the mask continues outside of it. So it doesn't matter if I then go back to a clone of this mask and then start editing the mask again, it's going to make no difference. I've got the whole thing included in my mask because I used that radial gradient. So with a portrait version versus landscape version, I don't know, entirely up to you in that sense. But what we can also do in terms of getting these guys' details up, let's go to, in fact, I'm just going to delete that version because we'll do it in a second. I'm going to edit on one and then we'll create a different crop afterwards. So let's go to our brush tool and I'm going to create a new layer. So we'll call this one vignette and we'll call this one birds. And with our layer, I'm just going to create quite a deep mask specifically around these guys. And with that mask, we're going to pull up a bit of clarity. So that's going to make them pop a little bit. But more importantly, let's look in here. Let's pull up some structure. And we get all that detail on the feathers and the edges and all the textures up. With that, we can, if we want to, pull up a bit of shadow as well. So this is all about how do I get the detail back to be on these birds. And then there's one final extra one, which I'm going to say head of big bird, because I don't know how else to describe it. And with this one, we're just going to go onto a little brush. And you can guess what I'm probably going to do. So let's just draw a little mask over the head of our bird. There, I'm not too worried about being neat, and the reason is because I'm only going to affect the shadows by pulling up shadow and pull up black. Now to make that blend nicely, we're just going to erase around the edges so that we don't notice that that mask is going on. I'm just going to lower our opacity just so that we're blending it a little bit when we get to the edges. But all that mask is doing is just allowing me to pull up the detail in that main bird. Now, with that done, we can now right click, clone variant, go back to my crop, and we can make that change to a portrait one. No problem, because all of those masks and all of those layers have carried across with my clone and my variant. And then I've got two versions. But if I go to this version and we do our before and after, there's our before and there's our after. It's a lot more subtle, it's a lot darker for sure, but I think it keeps your eye more on the subject by doing it that way than by having all of those highlights and all those blowouts. Okay, where are we in terms of questions? So Color, when you start a linear gradient, sometimes it's immediately a tight fall off and sometimes soft. All it comes down to is when you start, you've got to start drawing. So if I go back to our shot from Francois here and create a brand new empty layer, if I just click and let go, I end up with a very, very tight variant, or a very, very tight mask. If I click and hold and keep it held and move it around, then I can soften it from the very beginning. So that's just down to how you're first doing it. Okay, so that's it pretty much for today. Just reminder, so do go on to that competition site. You can win your next upgrade of version 21 when it comes out. And just over 2 weeks, David and I'll go through all those results. We'll remind you again in next week's session. Next week's session will be on Thursday, normal time, 3 o'clock UK, and so on. In the meantime, remember you've got that Facebook group which has got all the information that we'll cover in the next week before we get into our editing. But overall, 4 really, really nice shots. Do remember to send in all of your extra shots using this tool. So make sure that you send in a raw, and if you want an EIP file with the edits that you've already made, no problem. And then also remember you've got those pro tips things, so things like dehaze, things like sharpening, things like auto mask. We've covered a lot of them in those, and there'll be more coming out over the next few weeks for sure. In the meantime though, stay safe. We'll see how that little competition in America finishes up, maybe by next week. And we'll catch you next Thursday at 3 o'clock. See you later. Bye.